The night was cold and quiet, the kind of stillness that only happens after midnight. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. The dim lights of the Chicago train station cast long, eerie shadows over the empty platform as I made my way toward the Nightfall Express. My name is Matthew Hartwell, and I've been a train conductor for nearly 15 years. I thought I had seen it all: late-night drunks, rowdy passengers, even the occasional ghost story from old-timers trying to spook the newbies. But nothing could have prepared me for the Nightfall Express. Tonight was my first shift on this particular route, one I had been warned about by the older conductors. They spoke of strange occurrences, but I had laughed it off as nothing more than superstitious nonsense. After all, a train was just a train, right? But when I arrived at the platform, there was something different about the Nightfall Express. It was an old, weathered train, the kind you only see in movies, dark green with rusted metal accents, its paint peeling away like dead skin. The train loomed over me, its windows dark and foreboding, almost as if it were watching me. "Welcome aboard," said the station master, an elderly man with deep-set eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. He handed me a clipboard with the list of rules, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed mine. "Follow these, and you'll be fine." I looked down at the list, the words scrawled in jagged handwriting. Number 1. If a passenger without a ticket boards, do not acknowledge their presence. Number 2. Do not enter car number 5 between 1:30 and 1:45 a.m. Number 3. If you hear knocking from the cargo car, do not investigate. Number 4. Passengers must never be allowed to disembark at Station 13, no matter how much they beg. Number 5. If you see someone standing on the tracks ahead, sound the horn twice and do not slow down. Number 6. If the lights flicker between 3 o'clock and 3:15 a.m., close your eyes until they stabilize. Never look into the reflection in the windows after 4 a.m. I looked up at the station master, confused. Is this some kind of joke? But the old man's face was deadly serious. "You'd best heed those rules, son," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Nightfall Express doesn't forgive mistakes." Before I could ask him to explain, he turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone on the platform with nothing but the sound of the wind and the creaking train cars. With a deep breath, I stepped aboard. The interior of the train was dimly lit, with old brass fixtures and dark wood panels that creaked with every step. The faint smell of oil and something musty lingered in the air. I made my way to the conductor's compartment, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me like a second skin. The train's whistle blew, a low, mournful sound that echoed into the night. It was time to depart. I glanced at my watch, 11:59 p.m. Right on schedule. As the train lurched forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that once we left the station, there would be no turning back. As the Nightfall Express pulled out of the station, the world outside the windows turned into a blur of shadows. The city lights quickly faded into darkness, replaced by the moonlit silhouettes of trees rushing past. I settled into my conductor's seat, the old leather creaking under my weight. The steady clatter of wheels on the tracks was oddly soothing, a rhythmic lullaby for the journey ahead. The list of rules the station master had handed me lay on the control panel in front of me. I couldn't help but read it again, the words seeming even stranger now that we were moving. Why would a train conductor need to worry about things like not acknowledging passengers without tickets or avoiding a specific car at certain hours? I shook my head. Maybe it was just some kind of hazing ritual for new conductors on this route. That's what I told myself, anyway. But the older conductor's warnings echoed in my mind: the Nightfall Express doesn't forgive mistakes. I turned my focus back to my duties. The train had a modest number of passengers tonight, perhaps a dozen or so. Most were quiet, keeping to themselves, their faces hidden behind newspapers or lost in the glow of their phones. It was typical for this time of night, people traveling alone, trying to reach their destination as quickly and quietly as possible. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. I was making my way down the aisle of the first passenger car, checking tickets. The overhead lights cast a dim, yellowish glow, flickering slightly as the train rattled over the tracks. Most of the passengers handed over their tickets without a word, barely looking up from their seats. I had nearly finished checking the tickets when I saw him. He was sitting alone in the back corner of the car, facing away from me. The man wore an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in black and white photographs from the 1930s. His hair was neatly combed, but something about him felt off. His posture was too rigid, like he was a mannequin placed there to fill a seat. I approached cautiously, clipboard in hand. "Ticket, please," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't move. He just sat there, staring out the window. I repeated my request, louder this time, but he remained completely still. I took a step closer, my heart beginning to race. Then I remembered rule number 1, if a passenger without a ticket boards, do not acknowledge their presence. A cold chill ran down my spine. I backed away, forcing myself to look anywhere but at the unmoving figure. My hands were shaking slightly as I turned to leave the car. But before I could, I heard it, a faint whisper. "You shouldn't have asked." I froze. The voice was low, almost a growl, but it was unmistakably coming from the man. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were encased in concrete. I forced myself to take a deep breath, clinging to the rules that had been drilled into me. I kept my eyes forward, pretending I hadn't heard anything, and quickly made my way to the next car. The whisper continued, just loud enough to reach my ears. "You're not supposed to see me." I hurried through the door and slammed it behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment the door closed, the whispering stopped, leaving behind only the sound of the train rattling on the tracks. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. Had I just imagined that? Or was it real? I glanced back through the small window in the door, expecting to see the passenger still sitting there. But the seat was empty. Shaking off the encounter, I continued through the train, trying to focus on my duties. But my nerves were frayed, and every creak of the train seemed louder, every shadow darker. As I moved between the cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finally reached car number 5, the car I was strictly forbidden to enter between 1:30 and 1:45 a.m. according to rule number 2. I checked my watch, 1:15 a.m. I still had 15 minutes before the forbidden window began, but the very sight of the car sent a shiver down my spine. The door to car number 5 was different from the others. It was made of old, dark wood, with a brass handle that looked worn and tarnished. There was a small plaque above it that read, "Cargo," but I had been told that this car was never to be opened during the specific time window. Curiosity gnawed me, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. I could hear faint noises from the other side of the door, whispers, like the ones I'd heard from a strange passenger, mingled with what sounded like scratching. I turned away, forcing myself to keep walking. I couldn't afford to break another rule, not after my encounter with the ticketless passenger. But as I continued down the corridor, the whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. "Help us, please." The voices were faint but desperate, like they were coming from deep underwater. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to drown out the sound. Finally, I reached the end of the car and slammed the door behind me, cutting off the whispers. I took a moment to collect myself. My watch read 1:29 a.m. One more minute and I would have been in serious trouble. I wasn't sure what would happen if I broke the rule, but I had a feeling it wouldn't be anything good. As the clock struck 2 a.m., I entered the dining car. The old-fashioned decor felt like stepping back in time, with red velvet seats and brass fixtures that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Most of the passengers were asleep or staring vacantly out the windows. That's when I noticed her, a woman sitting alone at one of the tables, sipping from a delicate porcelain teacup. Her attire was strange, a vintage dress from the early 1900s, complete with lace gloves and a wide-brimmed hat. She looked like she had stepped out of a different era entirely. I approached her, hoping to ease my own nerves with a simple ticket check. But as I drew closer, the air grew cold, and a peculiar scent filled the room, like old flowers left to rot. "Ticket, ma'am?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto mine. They were a pale, milky white, as if she were blind, yet they seemed to see right through me. She smiled, her lips parting to reveal teeth that were far too sharp. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You broke the rules." My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she slowly rose from her seat, gliding toward me with unnatural grace. Her feet didn't seem to touch the floor. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, but before I could turn to run, she was gone. The dining car was empty, the lingering scent of decay the only evidence that she had ever been there. I staggered back to the conductor's compartment, my mind racing. I had to stay focused, to remember the rules. As I reached the front of the train, I checked the schedule. The next stop was Station 13, a place I had never heard of. The train began to slow, the sound of the brakes hissing through the silence. But as we approached the station, a strange dread filled my chest. There was something wrong here. I could feel it in my bones. The train came to a stop, the doors opening with a soft hiss. A young boy dressed in old-fashioned clothing stood on the platform, his eyes wide and pleading. "Please, let me off. I have to get home." Rule number 4: passengers must never be allowed to disembark at Station 13, no matter how much they beg. The boy's eyes were filled with tears, and his small hands pressed against the glass of the door. "Please," he whispered. "He's going to find me." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to let him out. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't let you leave." The boy's expression twisted into something monstrous, his innocent face contorting with rage. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his voice suddenly deep and echoing. Then he vanished, leaving behind only a faint shadow where he had stood. The doors closed, the train lurching forward once more, leaving Station 13 behind. But the boy's words echoed in my mind, filling me with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. What had I just done? What rules had I broken, or was I being tested in ways I couldn't yet comprehend? The train's rhythmic clatter was usually a comforting sound, but tonight it only amplified the growing dread in my chest. I tried to shake off the unsettling encounter with the boy at Station 13, but his twisted, angry face haunted me. The way his innocent eyes had transformed into something inhuman, it gnawed me, even now. I couldn't help but wonder, how many rules had I already come close to breaking without even realizing it? I kept glancing at the list, reading and rereading it, trying to commit every word to memory. But the rules themselves were so vague, so cryptic, that it was impossible to understand them fully. The passengers had grown quieter, their faces pale and drawn. It was as if the very air inside the Nightfall Express had changed, growing heavier and harder to breathe. I noticed shadows moving in the corners of my vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. As the minutes ticked by, I could feel something shifting. The train was no longer just a means of transportation, it was a labyrinth, a prison, something alive that thrived on fear. And I was trapped inside it. I was patrolling the train, trying to keep myself busy, when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic knocking coming from car number 5. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at my watch, it was 1:20 a.m., just 10 minutes before the forbidden window. The knocking was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, like someone desperately trying to get out. Rule number 3: if you hear knocking from the cargo car, do not investigate. I froze, my instinct screaming at me to turn around, to walk away. But curiosity, that damned insatiable curiosity, had me rooted in place. The sound was so human, so desperate, like a plea for help. I couldn't just ignore it, could I? "Help me," the voice was muffled, barely more than a whisper, but I heard it clearly. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle of the door to car number 5, but then I stopped myself. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. The rules were clear: do not investigate. I couldn't afford to break another rule. Not after the encounter with the boy. The knocking continued, growing louder, more frantic. The handle felt cold under my hand, almost as if it were alive, trying to draw me in. I took a deep breath, stepped back, and forced myself to walk away, leaving the unanswered pleas behind me. But as I moved down the corridor, the knocking followed me, growing louder until it was deafening. My heart raced, my hands slick with sweat. But I kept walking, refusing to look back. Finally, as I turned the corner, the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. I collapsed against the wall, my entire body shaking. The Nightfall Express was toying with me, pushing me closer to the edge. I realized then that the rules weren't just arbitrary guidelines, they were traps, designed to test my willpower, to see how far I would go before breaking. I had barely recovered from the knocking incident when I heard footsteps behind me. They were soft, almost hesitant, like someone was following me but didn't want to be noticed. I spun around, expecting to see one of the passengers, but the corridor was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I turned back toward the sleeper car, my pulse still racing. The corridor was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering sporadically. As I made my way through, I heard soft murmuring, like someone whispering just out of earshot. The sound sent chills down my spine. I reached the sleeper car and pushed the door open, stepping inside. It was darker here, the only light coming from the small lamps above each bunk. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic. The car was mostly empty, with only a few passengers dozing fitfully in their bunks. I was about to leave when I noticed one of the bunks at the far end. The curtain was drawn shut, but I could see a faint glow emanating from within, like a candle flickering in the darkness. My instincts told me to ignore it, but something compelled me to move closer. As I reached for the curtain, a cold, clammy hand shot out from the darkness, grabbing my wrist with a grip that was impossibly strong. "Don't go there," a voice whispered, so close to my ear that I could feel the cold breath on my skin. "You don't belong here." I yanked my hand free, stumbling back in horror. The curtain flung open, revealing an empty bunk. The glow was gone, the whispering silenced. I looked around frantically, but the other passengers remained motionless, as if nothing had happened. I backed out of the sleeper car, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever that was, it wasn't human. The Nightfall Express was full of passengers who weren't alive, who were reliving their final moments, trapped in some endless loop. By the time I returned to the conductor's compartment, my nerves were shot. The list of rules was burning a hole in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the ones I hadn't broken yet. What would happen if I did? What was waiting for me if I failed? As if in response to my thoughts, the lights flickered. I checked my watch. It was exactly 3 a.m. My blood ran cold. Rule number 6. If the lights flicker between 3 o'clock and 3:15 a.m., close your eyes until they stabilize. The flickering grew more violent, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. My instincts screamed at me to look, to see what was causing it. But I remembered the boy's twisted face, the pleading voices, and the icy grip of the hand in the sleeper car. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the sides of my seat as the train rattled and groaned. The flickering lights cast odd, strobing patterns even through my closed eyelids, making my head spin. I could hear something moving around me, something that dragged itself along the floor, its breath heavy and rasping. "Matthew," the whisper was right next to my ear, almost playful. "Open your eyes." I held my breath, trying to block it out. The lights continued to flicker, the shadows pressing against my eyelids like dark tendrils trying to force them open. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flickering stopped. The lights returned to their dim, steady glow, and the oppressive weight lifted from my chest. I cautiously opened my eyes, half expecting to see something horrific waiting for me. But there was nothing. Just the empty conductor's compartment, the familiar creaking of the train, and the echo of my own ragged breaths. As I tried to steady my nerves, I heard someone clear their throat behind me. I turned to see a man standing in the doorway of the conductor's compartment. He was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and clothes that looked like they were from another century. "I need to get off at Station 13, he said in a monotone voice. His eyes never blinked, never left mine. I shook my head. "I'm sorry, but I can't let anyone off there. It's against the rules." The man's expression didn't change. "Please. I have to leave before he finds me." Rule number 4. Passengers must never be allowed to disembark at Station 13, no matter how much they beg. "I can't," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man stared at me for a long moment, his eyes dark and empty, before slowly turning and walking away. But as he disappeared down the corridor, I noticed something. He left no footprints. The train's whistle blew, signaling our approach to the next station. My watch read 3:45 a.m., and we were nearing Station 13. The air around me grew colder, the shadows darker. I had followed every rule so far, but it was getting harder. The train was testing me, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The Nightfall Express continued to cut through the darkness like a blade, the steady rumble of the tracks vibrating through my bones. I was exhausted, my nerves frayed to the point of breaking. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a threat, a trick to lure me into breaking the rules. The clock on the wall read 4 a.m., and we were about an hour away from reaching Station 13 again. I kept replaying the events of the past few hours in my mind, the strange passenger who vanished, the desperate knocking in the forbidden cargo car, and the hollow-eyed man who pleaded to be let off at Station 13. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the rules weren't just about keeping order on the train. They were a way to protect me from something. But from what? As if in answer to my thoughts, the train gave a violent lurch. I stumbled, grabbing onto a seat for support as the lights flickered briefly. When they came back on, the air felt colder, the shadows darker. And then I heard it again, that relentless knocking coming from the cargo car. Rule number 3. If you hear knocking from the cargo car, do not investigate. The rule echoed in my mind like a warning bell, but the knocking was so persistent, so desperate, that it was impossible to ignore. It sounded like someone, or something, was pounding against the walls, trying to break free. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I had already been tempted to investigate the first time I heard it, but this time the knocking was louder, more frantic. It was as if whatever was inside the cargo car was getting closer to escaping. "No," I whispered to myself. "Don't do it. Just walk away." But the knocking continued, accompanied now by a low, mournful wail that sent chills racing down my spine. I could almost feel the vibration of each pound reverberating through the floor beneath my feet. I tried to force myself to leave, but curiosity, damned, relentless curiosity, kept me rooted to the spot. What could be in there? What was so dangerous that it had to be locked away? Remember the rules, Matt. Break them, and you'll regret it. But what if someone really needed help? What if there was a passenger trapped inside? I took a few tentative steps toward the door to car number 5, my heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out the rhythmic clatter of the train. The old wooden door was slightly ajar, and I could see faint shadows moving within. My instincts screamed at me to stop, to turn back, but my hands were already reaching for the handle. Just as I was about to push the door open, the knocking stopped. The sudden silence was so complete that it made my ears ring. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark, yawning void beyond. A cold draft blew through the doorway, carrying with it the scent of decay and something metallic, like rust or blood. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "Help me," the voice came again, but this time it was clearer, closer. It was a whisper filled with despair, like someone who had been trapped for years and was finally begging for release. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I can't. I'm not breaking the rules." But the voice continued, now more pleading, almost childlike. "Please. I'm cold. I'm so cold." Tears stung my eyes. I could feel the weight of the unseen presence pressing against my mind, trying to break through my resolve. But I remembered the boy's twisted face at Station 13, the hollow-eyed passenger who disappeared, and the terrifying figure in the sleeper car. I turned away from the cargo car, forcing myself to walk back toward the conductor's compartment. But as I did, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. The knocking resumed, louder than ever, the entire train seeming to vibrate with each pound. I covered my ears, trying to drown out the noise, but it was no use. It felt like the sound was coming from inside my own head, echoing in my skull. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the knocking stopped. I turned around, half expecting to see something burst through the door. But instead, there was a small slip of paper pushed through the crack beneath it. My hands trembled as I picked it up. "You broke the rule. There will be consequences." My stomach dropped. I hadn't even opened the door, but somehow the train knew. I had acknowledged the presence, had been too close to breaking the rule, and now I was marked. As I staggered back to my compartment, the lights flickered again. My watch read 4:05 a.m. My heart skipped a beat as I remembered rule number 7, never look into the reflection in the windows after 4 a.m. The entire train was lined with windows on either side, each one reflecting the dim, flickering lights. I tried to keep my eyes down, focused on the floor, but the urge to look was overwhelming. I could feel something watching me, feel its eyes boring into the back of my skull. As I hurried past the windows, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. It was a figure standing in the reflection, but when I turned to look at the empty aisle behind me, there was nothing there. Don't look," I muttered to myself, clenching my fists so hard that my nails dug into my palms. But it was too late. My eyes darted to the reflection, just for a fraction of a second. The figure was there, tall, with elongated limbs that shouldn't have been possible. Its face was a twisted mockery of a human, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. It tilted its head, mimicking my every move. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The thing in the reflection smiled, a grin that stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I blinked, and it was gone. The reflection returned to normal, showing only the empty train car. But I could still feel its presence, like a cold hand resting on my shoulder. I was still reeling from the encounter when I heard footsteps behind me. My pulse quickened. There were no scheduled stops between here and Station 13, and the other passengers were supposed to be asleep. I turned slowly, half expecting to see the twisted figure from the reflection. But it was just a passenger, a woman in a long, tattered coat, her eyes wide and vacant. She held a crumpled ticket in her hand, which she extended toward me. "Sir, I need to get off at the next station," she said, her voice monotone. "Please. I have to get off." My throat tightened. The next stop was Station 13. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't let you off there." Her expression didn't change. "Please, he's coming for me." Before I could respond, the train gave another violent lurch, throwing me against the wall. The lights flickered once more, and the woman's face seemed to distort, her features melting and shifting like wax. "Let me out," she screamed, lunging toward me, her fingers twisted into claws. But as soon as the lights stabilized, she was gone. The aisle was empty, her scream still echoing in my ears. My watch read 4:45 a.m. We were 15 minutes away from Station 13. The air felt heavier, like the very train itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I could see the station approaching in the distance, a dark, shadowy outline against the faint glow of the early morning sky. I gripped the controls, trying to focus, trying to remember the rules. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had already lost. The train had tested me, and I had failed. As we pulled into the station, the lights flickered one final time. I heard a voice whisper in my ear, soft and mocking. "You can't escape, Matthew. You never could." The Nightfall Express ground to a halt with a long, agonizing screech as we pulled into Station 13. The air inside the train seemed to tighten, becoming almost unbreathable, and the lights flickered overhead, casting sporadic flashes of light that made the shadows seem to dance and writhe along the walls. The station itself was shrouded in darkness, barely illuminated by the train's dim exterior lights. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, its cracked platform overgrown with weeds and littered with debris. There were no signs of life, no sounds, only the cold wind whistling through the broken windows of the empty station building. I stood at the door of the conductor's compartment, watching, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The rules were clear: passengers must never be allowed to disembark at Station 13, no matter how much they beg. But as the minutes dragged on, I saw no movement, heard no pleas. Just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, the doors to the train slid open with a hiss. My heart leapt into my throat. I hadn't pressed the controls, hadn't authorized the stop. The train was acting on its own. A shadowy figure stepped onto the platform, a man dressed in an old suit, his silhouette barely discernible in the dim light. His eyes were hollow, sunken deep into his face, giving him the appearance of someone who had been starved of sleep for years. "Please, let me off," he whispered, his voice carrying through the stillness. He didn't beg or cry, his tone was eerily calm, almost resigned. "I have to get home. They're waiting for me." I gripped the door frame, my knuckles turning white. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice strained. "I can't let anyone off here." The man's face twisted into an expression of pure despair, but he didn't move closer. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "They'll punish me if I don't get off." I wanted to help him, every instinct screaming that this was just a terrified passenger. But the rules. I have to follow the rules. As if in response to my hesitation, the train's lights flickered once more, plunging everything into darkness for several heart-pounding seconds. When they flickered back on, the man was gone, leaving nothing behind but a thin trail of mist that quickly dissipated into the air. The doors to the train slid shut on their own, and the Nightfall Express jolted back to life, moving away from Station 13. I could feel the train's energy shifting, growing darker, more oppressive, like it was feeding off the fear that lingered in the air. I needed to check on the passengers. I made my way toward the dining car, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy. But as I entered, my heart sank. The passengers, who had been silent and stoic throughout the journey, were now different. Some were dressed in clothing that seemed far too old, their fashion reminiscent of the early 1900s, long coats, wide-brimmed hats, lace gloves. Their faces were pale, their eyes vacant, as if they were sleepwalking. Others were in modern clothes but had expressions that seemed frozen in time, like mannequins trapped mid-conversation. I walked slowly down the aisle, trying not to draw attention to myself. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something sweetly rotten, like decaying flowers. The murmurs of conversations filled the space, but the words were incomprehensible, distorted, like a record being played backward. I stopped beside a couple dressed in vintage clothing. The woman turned her head slowly toward me, her neck creaking as if it hadn't been used in years. Her eyes were cloudy, unfocused. "Do you know the way to Ashwood Falls?" she asked, her voice a hollow whisper. "We've been trying to get there for so long." I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. I'm not sure," I stammered, taking a step back. The man beside her turned to face me as well, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "Everyone gets lost here," he said. "You'll never leave." The lights flickered again, and the figures before me vanished. The dining car was empty, save for the echo of their voices lingering in the air. As I continued through the train, trying to keep my panic at bay, I heard soft footsteps behind me. They were light, almost playful, like a child's. I turned, and there he was, the young boy from earlier, the one who had begged to be let off at Station 13. "Please," he said, his eyes wide and glassy. "I want to go home. Can you help me?" My heart ached at the desperation in his voice, but I knew better now. He wasn't real. Or at least, not in the way I understood reality. I tightened my grip on the clipboard, trying to remember the rules. "You can't leave," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "None of us can." The boy's face twisted in frustration, and for a brief moment, I saw his true form, eyes hollowed out, skin peeling away like old paint, his mouth a dark, gaping void. He let out a scream that was more like a roar, shaking the walls of the train car. I staggered back, my hands covering my ears, but the sound continued to reverberate in my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block him out. When I opened them again, he was gone. But his words remained, etched into my mind like a brand: "You'll never escape." Shaken, I stumbled into the sleeper car, hoping for a moment of reprieve. The car was mostly dark, the only light coming from the flickering overhead lamps. I could hear the steady breathing of the passengers who had managed to fall asleep despite everything. As I walked down the narrow aisle, I noticed that some of the bunks had curtains drawn tightly shut. I tried to ignore the occasional whisper coming from behind them, focusing on the task at hand. But then I saw it, a hand sticking out from one of the closed curtains, its fingers long and skeletal. My first instinct was to pull the curtain open, to see if someone needed help. But the rules. I hesitated, remembering rule number 6, if the lights flicker between 3 o'clock and 3:15 a.m., close your eyes until they stabilize. The lights flickered again, and the hand twitched, curling its fingers as if beckoning me closer. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, filling the car with a chorus of voices. "You can't run," they said in unison. "You belong to the train now." I turned and fled, running as fast as I could through the narrow corridor, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers followed me, growing louder, turning into shrieks of rage and despair. It felt like the entire train was alive, reaching out to consume me. When I finally made it back to the conductor's compartment, I collapsed into the seat, struggling to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold on to the clipboard. I glanced down at the list of rules, desperately trying to make sense of everything. The passengers weren't just lost, they were trapped, reliving their final moments over and over again. The Nightfall Express wasn't a normal train, it was a purgatory, a place where souls were bound to wander for eternity. But why had I been chosen to conduct it? Why was I forced to follow these rules, to bear witness to their endless torment? Before I could contemplate further, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was the elderly station master who had given me the rules on my first night. "I see you're beginning to understand," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "The train collects the lost. Those who strayed from the path in life, those who are too afraid to move on." What am I doing here?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why me?" He smiled, a hollow, knowing smile that sent chills down my spine. "You were lost, too, Matthew. You just don't remember how you got here." As he spoke, the memories flooded back, a car crash on a dark, rainy night. The sound of shattering glass, the flash of headlights, the screams. My own desperate plea for help as I bled out in the twisted wreckage. I wasn't just the conductor. I was a passenger, too, one who had failed to follow the rules in life. The train's whistle blew, a mournful sound that echoed through the endless night. The Nightfall Express was moving again, carrying me and its passengers deeper into the darkness. The station master faded away, his cryptic words echoed in my mind as I stood alone in the conductor's compartment, the sounds of the train and the memories of my past blending into a chaotic whirlwind. My hands were trembling, sweat dripping down my face despite the chill that seeped through the air. "I'm a passenger too," I whispered to myself, struggling to make sense of the horrifying revelation. The memories of that night, the rain-slick road, the crash, the blood, were still foggy, like trying to recall a nightmare that felt too real. But now wasn't the time to dwell on it. The train was moving again, heading towards some unknown destination, and I had one final task ahead of me. I had to confront whatever was waiting in car number 5. The list of rules was clear: do not enter car number 5 between 1:30 and 1:45 a.m. I had been meticulous in following this rule before, avoiding the mysterious car like the plague. But now, the time for fear and hesitation was over. I needed answers. If the Nightfall Express was a purgatory, then car number 5 held the key to understanding what was really happening. My watch read 1:25 a.m. The forbidden window was about to open, and I had 15 minutes to explore the car before the rule would apply. I steeled myself, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out of the conductor's compartment. The hallway leading to car number 5 seemed to stretch longer than usual, the walls narrowing as if the train itself was trying to push me away. The air grew colder with each step, my breath forming misty clouds that dissipated in the dim light. The train's rumbling beneath my feet was like a heartbeat, a pulse that synced with my own as if the Nightfall Express was alive. The door to car number 5 loomed ahead, its dark wood etched with scratches and strange, indecipherable symbols. The brass handle was cold to the touch, sending a jolt up my arm that made me flinch. I hesitated, feeling a whisper of doubt creep into my mind. Was this really the right choice? But I couldn't turn back now. Whatever was in that car, it held the answers I needed. I had to understand why I was trapped here, why the train was toying with me and the other passengers. I took a deep breath, twisted the handle, and pushed the door open. Car number 5 was unlike any of the other compartments. The air was thick with a heavy, suffocating mist that made it difficult to breathe. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak and unsteady as if the darkness was devouring the light. The interior of the car was lined with old, dusty wooden pews like those in a church, their surfaces covered in a thin layer of frost. As I moved deeper into the car, I realized the pews were filled with figures sitting motionless, their heads bowed as if in prayer. At first, I thought they were passengers, but as I approached, my heart sank. They were corpses, their skin waxy and gray, eyes hollow and sunken into their skulls. A thick stench of decay filled my nostrils, and I fought the urge to gag. The bodies were dressed in clothes from different eras: Victorian gowns, World War II uniforms, 1960s bell-bottoms, as if they had been gathered from different points in time and placed here to rot. I turned my flashlight toward the far end of the car, where I could see an altar draped in black cloth. Something was moving behind it, a figure shrouded in shadows, too tall and too thin to be human. It seemed to ripple and shift as if it were made of smoke. My footsteps echoed loudly as I approached, each step taking me closer to whatever monstrosity awaited me. The temperature plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs, each one shorter than the last. The shadowy figure turned, revealing a face that was both familiar and grotesque. It was my own, twisted into a grin that stretched impossibly wide. "Matthew," it whispered in a voice that mimicked mine. "You're finally here." I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. What are you?" I demanded, my voice quivering. "I am what you've become," it hissed, its voice now layered with dozens of whispers. "You were meant to conduct this train, to guide these souls, but you failed. Now, you're trapped like the rest." The thing that wore my face moved closer, its limbs elongating, fingers curling into claws. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The door behind me had closed on its own, sealing me inside. The figure's grin widened as if it could read the questions swirling in my mind. "Do you understand now, Matthew?" it said, its voice dripping with mockery. "This train is a vessel, a bridge between the worlds of the living and the dead. It collects the lost, the damned, those who strayed too far into the darkness. And me?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. What did I do? You were chosen, it replied, its eyes gleaming with malice. Not as a punishment, but as an opportunity. You were given the chance to atone, to guide these souls to their final destinations. But instead, you became one of them. A flood of memories hit me all at once, the crash, the darkness, the voice whispering to me as I lay dying in the wreckage. I remembered making a desperate deal, agreeing to take on the role of conductor in exchange for another chance at life. But I had failed. I had broken the rules, allowed the darkness to seep into me. You broke the rules, Matthew, the creature continued. And now, you are bound to this train for eternity. I couldn't accept it. There had to be a way out, a way to break free. No, I said, shaking my head. There's always a way out. The shadowy figure let out a low, mocking laugh. Foolish mortal, it hissed. You think you can escape? The train demands a conductor. If you wish to leave, someone must take your place. I turned, desperately searching for a way out. The pews full of lifeless passengers seemed to sway, their heads turning to follow my movements. I realized then that these were all former conductors, souls who had been lured into breaking the rules, just like me. You could free yourself, the creature whispered, but only if you passed the curse on to another. You must choose a soul to condemn in your place. The horrifying realization sank in. The only way to free myself from the train was to damn another. Was that what had happened to me? Had the previous conductor passed the curse on to me? No, I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. I won't do it. The figure lunged at me, its twisted hands reaching for my throat. I braced myself, ready for the searing pain, but instead, I was enveloped in darkness. The shadows swallowed me whole, the sound of the train fading into nothingness. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in car number 5. I was standing in the conductor's compartment again, the list of rules clutched in my hand. The train was moving, its steady rhythm a cruel reminder that I was still trapped. The door to the compartment creaked open, and there stood Sarah, the woman I had thought was just another passenger. Her eyes were cold, her expression unreadable. "You're back," she said simply. I thought I escaped," I stammered, my voice hoarse. "You don't escape the Nightfall Express," she replied. "You either follow the rules, or you become one of us." I understood now. Sarah was a former conductor, just like me. She had broken the rules, had failed to pass on the curse, and now she was bound to the train. "You have one last chance, Matthew," she said, stepping closer. "Find someone to take your place, or you'll ride this train forever." I stared at the list of rules, the names of the passengers who were nothing more than lost souls trapped in a loop. There was no way out, no way to escape. The only way to free myself was to damn another to my fate. But could I do it? The train's whistle blew, a mournful sound that seemed to mock my indecision. The next station was approaching, and soon, the doors would open. I had a choice to make. The train was hurtling forward, the sound of the wheels on the tracks like a relentless drumbeat. I stared at the rules in my hands, my vision blurring as exhaustion and fear threatened to overwhelm me. Sarah's words kept replaying in my mind, "Find someone to take your place, or you'll ride this train forever." But how could I condemn another soul? Was that what the previous conductors had done to me? Trapped me here by passing the curse along, turning me into yet another pawn for the Nightfall Express? The train jolted, and I stumbled, bracing myself against the wall. The overhead lights flickered ominously, casting shadows that twisted and writhed like they were alive. I could feel the train's malevolent presence growing stronger. It was as if the entire locomotive was feeding off my fear, my despair. I glanced at my watch. 4 a.m. A cold dread settled in my gut as I remembered rule number 7, never look into the reflection in the windows after 4 a.m. But as I moved through the dimly lit corridors, something compelled me to look. It was as if an invisible hand had gripped the back of my head, forcing me to turn. My eyes drifted toward the window beside me, and I caught a glimpse of my reflection, or at least, what I thought was my reflection. The face staring back at me was not my own. It was twisted, grotesque, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. Its mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. My heart pounded in my chest as the reflection began to move on its own, independent of my actions. The figure in the glass tilted its head, mimicking the shadowy entity I had encountered in car number 5. "Matthew," it whispered, its voice distorted and echoing in my mind. "You can't escape what you are." I turned away, trying to shut out the voice, but it only grew louder, the words pounding in my skull like a relentless drum. The train's walls seemed to close in on me, the windows vibrating as if they were about to shatter. "Why do you resist?" the reflection hissed. "You made a deal, and now you must fulfill it." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the reflection's taunts. But even with my eyes closed, I could feel its presence, like a cold, wet breath against my neck. The air around me seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. When I finally opened my eyes, the reflection was gone, replaced by the darkened corridor and the faint glow of the overhead lights. But the whispering voice lingered, echoing in the depths of my mind. As the minutes ticked by, the train neared its next stop. I checked the route schedule. We were approaching Station 13 again. My stomach twisted in knots. The thought of returning to that cursed place filled me with a terror I couldn't shake. Suddenly, I heard a soft sobbing behind me. I turned to see a young woman sitting alone in one of the passenger cars. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You have to let me off at the next station. He's coming for me." My heart wrenched. She looked so helpless, so human. But I knew better now. The Nightfall Express was filled with passengers who were not what they seemed. They were echoes, trapped souls who would do anything to trick me into breaking the rules. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't let anyone off here." She reached for me, her fingers cold and skeletal. "You don't understand," she hissed, her voice twisting into something dark and guttural. "He's coming, and he'll take us all." I yanked my arm free, stumbling back. Her eyes turned black, her mouth stretching impossibly wide in a silent scream. But as I blinked, she was gone. The seat she had been occupying was empty, as if she had never been there. I made my way back to the conductor's compartment, my mind spinning. The train was speeding toward its final stop, and I knew time was running out. The rules were like chains around my wrists, binding me to this cursed place. Then, a thought struck me: what if I could end this? What if there was a way to break the cycle? But I knew what that would mean. Sarah had made it clear. The only way to free myself was to condemn another to take my place. As the train screeched to a halt at Station 13, the doors opened with a soft hiss. I could see the dark, fog-shrouded platform beyond, a yawning abyss that seemed to pull at me like a black hole. A lone figure stepped onto the platform, a young man in his early 20s, dressed in a simple black coat. He looked lost, confused, his eyes wide with fear. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice trembling. I don't remember how I got here." My heart sank. He was just like I had been on my first night, a lost soul caught in the web of the Nightfall Express. I could feel the train itself urging me, pushing me toward him. All I had to do was guide him onto the train, pass on the curse, and I would be free. But as I looked into his terrified eyes, I saw myself. I remembered the hopelessness, the despair of realizing I was trapped. Could I really do this? Could I condemn someone else to this eternal nightmare? "You made a deal, Matthew," the whispering voice in my head taunted. "Fulfill it, and you'll be free." I was shaking, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could hear Sarah's voice echoing in my mind: "Find someone to take your place, or you'll ride this train forever." The young man took a step back, sensing something was wrong. "Please, help me." But before I could speak, the lights flickered, and the train began to move again. The doors slammed shut, leaving the young man behind on the platform as the darkness swallowed him whole. As the train continued its relentless journey, I collapsed into my seat, my entire body shaking. I had failed to pass on the curse. I had chosen mercy over survival, and now I was damned to ride this cursed train for eternity. But something was different. The air around me seemed lighter, the oppressive weight that had clung to me since the beginning of my journey suddenly lifted. The reflection in the window shifted once more, but this time, it was different. Instead of the twisted, grinning figure, I saw myself. My real self. I looked weary, older, but there was a glimmer of something in my eyes, hope. "You broke the cycle," a familiar voice said behind me. I turned to see Sarah standing there, her eyes no longer cold and lifeless. "You chose mercy, and in doing so, you freed us all." "I don't understand," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I thought I was trapped." Sarah nodded, a faint smile on her lips. The Nightfall Express was a purgatory, a place for lost souls who were given one last chance to find redemption. By refusing to condemn another soul, you broke the cycle. The train began to slow, and I could see the faint glow of dawn breaking through the windows. The shadows that had once haunted the train were fading, replaced by warm, golden light. Where are we going?" I asked. Sarah's smile widened. "Home, Matthew. We're finally going home." The train came to a gentle stop at a station bathed in sunlight. As the doors opened, I felt a rush of fresh air fill the compartment. The oppressive weight that had been with me for so long was gone. I stepped off the train, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The platform was filled with people, souls who had once been trapped, now free to move on. I turned to see the Nightfall Express one last time, its once menacing exterior now glowing softly in the morning light. The train's whistle blew a final, mournful note, and then it vanished, leaving behind nothing but a gentle breeze. I was free. And as I walked away from the station, I knew that I had finally earned my second chance.